Greetings, friends and frenemies. It's time to talk about Star Wars again. Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, the middle of the prequel trilogies. Let's hop right into it. This is a movie from 2002 that I saw in theaters and is actually, of the 3 prequel movies, the one I remember most fondly from my theater experience. So it's really interesting to go back and view it with a more analytical, mature mind and see some of the things that I think really appealed to me back then and see some of the things that appeal to me now, and some of the flaws that exist in it that are sure to draw a little bit of criticism. But let's take a look at the whole thing. We'll go category by category, and we'll talk about general effect as well. So let's hop into it. First thing, production aesthetics. Aesthetics are going to be the overall visual design. This is, of course, a tremendous selling point of this movie, and I think it exceeds episode 1 by at least some significant margin in the way that it executes all its aesthetics and the way it presents them. And episode 1 is aesthetically a very beautiful movie, and this one as well. It's unique. It takes both the elements from the old trilogy and the new trilogy and mixes them together in really unique ways. You have several different environments. You have a new view of Coruscant. You have the nighttime Coruscant with this crazy chase scene that happens towards the beginning of the movie. You have the water planet with the cloners, and they, of course, have a new, unique look that couldn't have been executed with traditional puppetry, had to be executed with that CG. And that elimination of the boundaries of puppetry really allowed more crazier aesthetics to be presented in the movie. Yet somehow, even though they're different, they still fit in with Star Wars. It still felt a lot like Star Wars to me. Of course, you had the new views of Naboo and the cities in Naboo, which are quite cool sets. And you have Tatooine you revisit, and you also have a new twist in Geonosis, which is a kind of a desert-looking planet, and it combines that old used aesthetic with some of the new aesthetics. It's where the droids are made, and there's a great battle that happens on that particular planet. One of the best battles, I think, in the entire canon of Star Wars. If you haven't seen Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, just for the visual design alone, I think it's a movie that is worth seeing. The imagination present is really profound. One of the things is the new droids they bring in. So they take the droids from episode 1, they bring you even scarier droids, and then they bring in that stormtrooper aesthetic at the end. It looks like stormtroopers, but you could see how it's going to end up being evolved into stormtroopers. So if you're watching the prequels after the original trilogy, which is of course how I watched them, it's a really cool drawing of the old and the new. So I think the whole team did a really good job drawing those threads. Lastly, you do have one big promise that was sort of realized at the end of the movie, and that's large numbers of Jedi fighting with one another. This is something that fans wanted for a long time, and they finally got it in this movie, and I think that's one of the reasons that I remember the movie enjoying the movie so much in the theaters, was just this explosive final act. So overall, I have to give the aesthetics a 10 out of 10. That's a perfect score. I'm really hesitant to give a perfect score, but the imagination present is just great. The way that the aesthetics interact with the fidelity, with the possibility of the CG, allowed for a lot of new interesting things to happen that are quite a treat to watch. If you've never seen it, I think the aesthetics alone make it worth watching. Here's a couple of examples of what we've got. We've got Geonosis. You have some really beautiful scenes on Naboo where Anakin and Padme are attempting to have the beginning of a romantic relationship. This cloner facility, which has that slick white aesthetic to it, but has this dreary rain outside, so there's a great contrast going on there. And of course, nighttime Coruscant with its bright neon lights. It's like Vegas meets Blade Runner on steroids, you know. It's really, really a cool thing to finally get to see that. And all of these 4 areas really felt like Star Wars to me. It was kind of like same but different. I can't say that about the newer Disney movies. A lot of times I see their presentations of planets and they don't feel quite right to me. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I think that episode 2 really nailed the aesthetics. So let's talk a little bit about how those interact with the cinematography and visual effects. That's kind of the fidelity element. So this is the first Star Wars film to be shot entirely in digital. Episode 1 was shot primarily in film, and a couple of scenes were in digital. And if you have a good eye and you're watching the Blu-ray, you can tell which ones. There's a part where Qui-Gon jumps onto the ship, escaping Darth Maul, and you see it cut, and you could tell it goes to digital. The digital format, it's a little bit sharper. I know people will say, well, there's more visual information in film, but digital, it feels sharper. Things are more defined and just have cleaner edges to objects. And I think that the digital process actually made the compositing of the scenes run a little bit more smoothly than it had in Phantom Menace, where you have a mixture of elements like a matte painting combined with, some computer generated elements. They don't blend quite as well in film because you have this sharp digital image that you're kind of compositing onto something that is film and is a little bit blurrier by its nature. So the entire thing being shot in digital, I think, made the compositing a little bit more convincing. So the sharpness of the actors matches the environments when they're using green screen or when they're combining a set with a matte painting. Everything is really sharp and clear and well defined. However, there's a lot of seams in the CG characters, particularly like in the diner scene. You have this alien who, it's really well done, but because it's so brightly lit, you can really tell it's CG. Its skin is a little too reflective. There's not as much contrast as you would get, and there's no hot spots on the skin like what you normally get with like real physical objects or like with a puppet. However, I still think the compositing overall is probably equivalent to a modern production. And I think modern productions avoid these scenes like the diner scene, having learned from Attack of the Clones that if you have a character kind of up front and center to the camera, it's really easy for people to figure out that it's computer generated because it's just really hard to get faces to animate just perfectly enough. There's a little bit of an uncanny valley there. So I think you see more of this compositing in darker areas of films, in modern films. But in general, I think the compositing, the mixture of CG, matte painting, sets, and effects is generally pretty good throughout, and probably equivalent to a modern film if you were to watch this particular movie on Blu-ray. So the editing and the pacing, I think, are actually superior to Episode 1. Now, people have complained to me that this one is like the slower of the films. Well, it's also the most plot heavy. It's the most story heavy of the films. However, you don't have this problem where you're spending time on a lot of expositional dialogue. Yes, there's expositional dialogue. It's much better than it was in Episode 1. And in general, the editing of the action is a lot smoother. So things feel like they're more energetic, even though it really has kind of a slower pace even than Episode 1. And I think that's just, it ended up being edited a little bit better. There's a lot of clarity in the blocking. Let me explain this. So because George Lucas shoots with this, what some people have called like a documentary style, it's a wide shot of an environment. The camera doesn't move. The actors are moving almost as if you're watching them on stage. Because of how clear the actors are and how clear the blocking is, you can see every little flaw that might exist in the mixture of computer generated graphics, the digital effects like lightsabers, and their environments that aren't real and the things that are real. You can see all the little seams because of George Lucas's visual style. Now, I think that visual style might have made the compositing easier back in the 70s and 80s when it was a lot harder to do. But since Attack of the Clones, I think cinematographers and filmmakers in general have learned that with the power of computers, it's a little bit better to do some of these techniques, and some techniques people don't like the shaky cam, where you're shaking it. When you make action unclear, it makes it harder to tell that it's computer generated. And in this case, the action is so clear, it's easy to tell. But this doesn't mean that Attack of the Clones has worse CG than other movies. It's just shot in a style that's so clear and so easy to follow the action that any kind of flaw is much more noticeable. And there's other scenes as this as well. There's a scene where Anakin kind of like uses the Force to pitch this pear fruit over to Padme, and she bites it, and there's like a seam. You can tell that like the biting of the apple kind of goes through her lip in the wrong way. And that's because it's really clear, and they probably in a modern production would know to avoid attempting that shot. But because this was pretty cutting edge at the time, you didn't always know what you needed to avoid and what you needed to attempt. So I think George Lucas tried lots of different things. I think he approached the film without any limitations in mind because of how well Phantom Menace went. So there are seams, but overall, I don't think it's any worse than a modern production in terms of its execution. I think it has some mistakes with that cinematography style that lend you to knowing that there's seams, but certainly overall the visual effects are really good. And in general, when you watch those battles and you see how insane and how baroque the level of detail is in this movie, it's hard to not admire it. So I give it an 8.5 out of 10 because the seams are there, but there's so much good stuff that you probably don't notice that's so well done. It's good. It really holds up to me. Let's talk about score. There's not that much to say about the score other than it's good. John Williams knows how to write a Star Wars score, and he delivers another good one. The direction of George Lucas also really, I think, synergizes very well with John Williams in a way that is very apparent. That synergy is not there in the newer films, in the Disney films. Particularly with J.J. Abrams, he doesn't give these kind of spacious moments where two actors are sitting there not having dialogue and the score essentially tells you something. So there's some points where, like, Anakin expresses this grief over his mother dying, and then you hear the Imperial March played in a little bit of an interesting permutation, thus letting you know something about the character, that the dark side is at work there, right? So there's an operatic element to it, like in all of the other Star Wars movies. There's a lot of variety there as well, and lots of little new things throughout the movie. So he uses the old and uses the new pretty well. Overall, I think it's a well-executed score. I give it a 9 out of 10. I would still enjoy listening to this score on its own. I think I like Phantom Menace and Return of the Jedi a little bit more, but this one does a pretty good job, and I think it's probably, I think it's superior to maybe Empire Strikes Back as well. But it's generally, John Williams does good scores, so it's hard to knock how this one's executed. Sound design is another really, really strong point about Star Wars, particularly George Lucas Star Wars, and it's something that was missing, I think, with J.J. Abrams, is the sharpness and detail and the exciting pop of the sound design that George Lucas executed with this movie and with all of his other Star Wars movies. That variation between loud and soft, and where he really puts a ton of energy in the high frequencies when the lightsabers crash, when things bang, they really have a big noticeable impact. And at the same time, the dialogue is mixed in so well that the dialogue is always clear. And this, I think, actually, if you watch this on a good 5.1 system, or you were to see this in theaters, this is another one of those kind of recursive loops that happen when you increase fidelities, that you're able to have the dialogue remain so clear while giving so many other cool effects to the surround part, that you can have big impact surrounding the viewer and still have the dialogue loud and clear and easy to recognize. So it's always understandable. This is not the case for a lot of modern movies, where the dialogue will get buried in the effects, or the effects will be so compressed that they just don't have any impact. So the sound blocking is here's what I mean by sound blocking. So there's good sound blocking, meaning when there's dialogue happening, you're not attempting to have dialogue happen over really loud popping sounds. So the dialogue is interspersed with the sounds, so you're never subjected to loud and dialogue. You have these things kind of end up separate, and that lets you maintain that high impact sound design. And there's a lot of actually new and unique sounds that are present in this. New sounds of blasters, new sounds of ships that make interesting sounds. So there's always some new elements that get brought into these movies, and this one is no exception. So I have to give the sound design a 10 out of 10. It's really good. It's as good as any Star Wars movie, and they're generally, when you're talking about sound design, they knock it out of the park. George Lucas always makes sure that the sound design is great in a Star Wars movie. So overall production values, I think it's equal in execution to modern movies, especially on modern replay devices. So a modern high definition TV watching the Blu-ray with a good sound system, it's going to feel equivalent to modern movies. Perhaps superior in some ways because the visual effects are so clear, but inferior in other ways because it's so easy to notice the things which are effects versus the things which are part of the set or part of the actor's attire, for instance. There's a lot of great choreography. I consider that part of the production. You have all these millions, or not millions of Jedis. You have dozens of Jedi fighting, all of that, all of those effects present, all the choreography present's good. The lightsaber duels are actually pretty good, and I actually think they remind me a lot of the original trilogy, like a little bit better of that. So if you thought that the lightsaber battle in episode 1 was like too crazy, these lightsaber battles are a little bit more conservative. little bit different variation on them, but they work pretty well. And the visual techniques that were used in episode 1, they're used here, but better. And this is going to be a controversial opinion, but the CG Yoda, I think, was a very good choice compared to the puppet from Empire Strikes Back, and there's a bunch of reasons for this. The first one is the CG Yoda is actually capable of a much greater variety of expression. He can look sad and angry, and although the puppet from Empire Strikes Back and from Return of the Jedi is a good puppet, I thought the one from this last one, The Last Jedi, looked awful. But the one from Empire Strikes Back looks good, but a lot of it has to do with Frank Oz is really good at playing Yoda, and he plays Yoda in this one. And the lighting helped disguise some of, the fact that the puppet had a limited range of expression. In this case, the puppet's fully capable of expressing sadness, worry, doubt. All of these deeper kind of facial expressions are present with Yoda, and it's necessary because Yoda's very troubled in this movie. He's very worried. His connection with the Force has been very disrupted. There's a scene where him and Mace Windu are talking, and they can't figure out what's wrong, but they're not able to sense correctly what's going on in the Force. And you get this, just kind of this sad, kind of withdrawn looking Yoda. And that kind of look and that kind of performance just wouldn't have been possible with the puppet. I know that might be a controversial opinion, but I watched the movie and I have to draw that conclusion. The CG Yoda was a great choice to make, and replacing the puppet Yoda from episode 1 in the Blu-ray with the CG Yoda, I also approve of that decision. I know it's very controversial when George Lucas changes something after the fact, but the puppet in episode 1 never quite looked right, and now you have a continuous look with Yoda. If you look at the prequels as one set of movies that's really separate from the original trilogy, I think having one unified look for Yoda is a good idea. So overall, the production lands a 9.4 out of 10. That should be a very, very good score for a Star Wars movie, and certainly this is in terms of production, it was a feat, just like episode 1 was. But production alone does not make a great movie. Let's move on to story. Characters, to me, are really the big flaw in this movie, and they're big mixed bag in terms of execution. And I'm going to talk about the dialogue and the way they're acted, because those two things always go together in a movie. You can have really bad dialogue that's very well acted. You can have very good dialogue that's very poorly acted. And those things can't really be separated when you're watching them on screen. So the first thing is, I think Hayden Christensen was very miscast as Anakin Skywalker. And the reason is that he couldn't deliver the entire range of the character. He could deliver this angsty, angry version of Anakin, but couldn't deliver an appealing sexual Anakin that Padme would actually be attracted to. He couldn't deliver a calm and assertive Anakin. He could only really play on this one note of kind of teenage angst and worry, and it just doesn't do the character justice. I think that was a miscast. Natalie Portman, she's kind of flat in this movie. She just doesn't really have any screen presence, and you combine her with Hayden Christensen, and it just doesn't. There's no chemistry there. Christopher Lee, however, is awesome, and even though Count Dooku doesn't have a huge role in the film, Christopher Lee really sells it. When you finally meet Christopher Lee and all the scenes with him and Ewan McGregor, he's very good. He was an extremely accomplished actor, and he definitely sold his role very well. In fact, I'll show you one particular few seconds of the movie, about 10 seconds of the movie, and about 5 of it is just a single expression by Christopher Lee that tells you the entire plot of the next movie. In a single expression, he communicates what pages of dialogue could not communicate. He does a great job, and his voice is very powerful with it as well. Even though he's old, and actually I think he had to have a CG double do a bunch of different parts of the fight scenes, it was definitely well cast, and I think it was a great choice to have Christopher Lee as the very tall and frightening Count Dooku. He's like the Darth Vader. He should have been the Darth Vader of this prequel trilogy, and certainly Christopher Lee would have done a great job with that. Ewan McGregor is good as a more mature Obi-Wan, an Obi-Wan that's struggling to contain the aspirations and the power of his apprentice in Anakin, and even kind of is able to portray a little bit of jealousy and worry over Anakin as well. So he has a great range of his performances, also a good casting choice. Samuel L. Jackson's a mixed bag in that in some cases his kind of dour, glowering kind of demeanor really is good for Mace Windu. At other times, his limited range of delivery doesn't express fully what I think Mace Windu should have been in certain points. He is a little bit flat on the dialogue delivery, and although it's okay, I think it's probably more on the positive side, and that's probably because I like Samuel L. Jackson, and I think he certainly has a great screen presence in terms of the intensity of his look. It overall kind of works. The child actor that played Boba Fett, I don't know his name. A little bit distracting, as child actors can be, however, minimally so. Overall, it was okay. Frank Oz, great as Yoda. He owns the character. But Yoda as a character feels slightly out of place, especially with his speaking style. He just seems, meeting Yoda as this weird little rumpy kind of green guy that turns out to be a Jedi Master and whose power is in his mind. That had a bigger impact or deception of the appearance than what we get with this one. We do get a deception of appearance at the end of the movie with Yoda. But overall, I actually liked Yoda in this movie, and I think he had an important part to play. The droids are back, which a lot of people were happy with. You have the droids instead of Jar Jar Binks, which is probably a good choice and probably what George Lucas should have done from the beginning. Their comedy is mostly poorly timed, but I can kind of say that about the original trilogy too, so that's what you get with that. The big problem with the characters is this story that kind of goes against itself. Two stories. You have Anakin as this attractive, as this lover of Padme, and presumably she'd be attracted to him, even though at the beginning of the movie she says a bunch of things that says he's really creepy, and then somehow comes around. And then you have this other path where Anakin's a tortured soul and essentially is beginning to turn to the dark side. And those two things don't go well together because Padme is there experiencing that with him, and he's revealing to her, I killed all the Sand People, I killed their children, and he's like crying over it. That doesn't seem like he's presenting something to a female which she would find attractive or virtuous or correct. So her falling in love with him while he is suffering this crisis with, beginning to fall to the dark side, believing that the Republic isn't working, expressing this desire for power in order to make things right. All these things which are important for his growth into Darth Vader don't really go well with this love story. And lastly, this is part of his miscasting. His voice is too high, and his delivery is a little too passive. And when you watch it, you'll kind of see. It's like, don't worry, no harm will come to her. It's like a boy talking. And I'm a heterosexual man, not a woman, so hopefully I'm not completely off base here. But women, especially mature women who are senators, I don't see them being highly attracted to passive boys. We needed a more masculine character to sell this. We needed a more masculine delivery. We needed his voice to have a little more subtlety and a little less constant angsty or just completely flat delivery. So he has angsty and flat. We needed more kind of brooding, deeper voice. And I think if you were to overdub this movie with a different voice, people like my voice, maybe I'll do it. I think if you were to overdub it with a different voice, you'd find that it was quite a bit better with a different voice. Lastly, there is some expositional dialogue, but it's much better than episode 1. And in general, the plot is told visually. It's up to the audience to figure out how the plot works. For a lot of people, they're telling me it's like, oh, the plot just made no sense. I'm like, plot made a lot of sense to me, but I kind of paid attention. And most of the expositional dialogue, it's pretty front loaded at the beginning of the movie, but that's true of most movies, and it's definitely true of most Star Wars movies. And in this case, it's a lot better expositional dialogue than what we got in episode 1, which had people sitting around essentially telling each other what they already knew. There's moment specific dialogue at the beginning where Anakin is expressing, he's like, I haven't seen her in 10 years and I've just thought about her nonstop. And Obi-Wan's like, dude, that's not healthy, basically. And it's a little creepy. That's important for shading the character and exposing him, but it is kind of relevant for the moment that they're in. So it's a little bit better than episode 1. So overall, the story portion that is the characters, to me, I give it a 6 out of 10. That's a passable score for me, and that's because of the strength of Ewan McGregor, Christopher Lee, Frank Oz, and generally the way that those plots played out with those characters, rather than the love story with Anakin and Padme, which to me tends to fall a little bit flat. So with that, let's move on to plot. Okay, so there were 4 main storylines going on in Attack of the Clones. You have the clone story, which is Obi-Wan essentially following Jango Fett and figuring out about this clone army and learning about what this was. Then you have a romance between Anakin and Padme is the primary B story. And then as a C story, you have Anakin stepping into the dark side, having bad dreams about his mother, and it's essentially taking revenge upon her kidnappers and murderers. And then lastly, you do have Yoda's experience with the Senate and with the Force. That's Yoda and Mace Windu kind of as Paragon-like, Gandalf-like characters trying to figure out the overarching connection of the things that they're witnessing, and expressing a lot of important little details about how Palpatine and the Senate end up kind of creating this clone army, essentially behind the Jedi's back. The romance subplot is the real failure of the plot, and it's basically due to the execution, the cross storylines, and the actors not really being able to sell it. It feels very flat. It's not nearly as interesting or convincing as, say, Leia and Han were. And being fans of Star Wars who were watching this, and I was, of course, it was very apparent that the romance didn't work out. But of course, a huge portion of episode 3 relies on this romance, so it's actually a big problem. And I think if you were to just fix one thing, it would have been recasting Hayden Christensen, just having a different actor there that was capable of expressing the entire range of the character. There is a disconnect with the resolution of the clone plot, which leads Obi-Wan to Geonosis. This is a little bit of a problem in that Obi-Wan follows Jango Fett out to this cloning facility, sees a bunch of clones that are supposedly being made for the Republic, then follows Jango Fett to Geonosis where the droids are being made. Yoda shows up with the clone troopers, and they don't really talk about the fact that why would Jango, like, what was the connection there? They never really discuss it, and they don't really discuss it in the next movie. Kind of leave that plot dangling and then don't really fulfill it. That's a little bit of a problem. However, in the context of the entire movie, there wasn't, because Yoda shows up with the clone army at the end, you don't really have time for them to sit around and talk about, like, wait a minute, Jango Fett did this, and which would have ended up kind of unraveling the setup for episode 3. This is the most plot-heavy Star Wars movie of all 6, in my opinion, and if you were to watch it, you'd probably see that. Those 4 plots, although episode 1, I think, had 5 different plots, those 4 plots have a lot going into them, and there's a lot of mystery behind, especially the clone, the primary one, the clone, what's this Jango Fett and the clone army plot. There's a lot of awkward moments designed to expose the setting while advancing the plot. One in particular is Obi-Wan goes to see Yoda about this missing star system, where everything's pointing to going to this star system, but it's not in the maps, and who altered the maps. And basically you see these little kids practicing with their lightsabers. It's just a chance to show off young Jedi for lore purposes. And Yoda does this thing where he asks the students and they give the obvious answer. But the moment feels a little awkward and off. And there's a couple of those. They don't detract that much, and they do give you some lore, so it's hard to know exactly what to do with them, whether they're bad or they're good. I think in the context, they feel a little awkward. So overall, I give the plot a 7 out of 10. Even though most of the plot is good, I think because you have this failure to sell the romance plot, you can't give this plot more than like an average rating, and 7 out of 10 for me is an average rating. Let's talk about some other stuff with the story, because there's a lot going on here. So the lore exposition is some of the strongest in the series. You have essentially showing where the clone army comes from, where the aesthetics of the Empire end up coming from. You have all of this exposition of the separatists, of Count Dooku, of the way the Sith work. You have an exposition of what Count Dooku was planning to do with Obi-Wan, which is direct, and what Darth Sidious was planning to do with Anakin, which is contained within a single moment. You have showing the little younglings with their lightsabers. You have more exposition of the Jedi Council, of the Senate, how things work in the Senate. The fact that the Republic doesn't have a standing army. There's a lot of fan service here too, and I think a lot of it's the kind of fan service I liked, and this is a big reason why I think I liked this movie when it came out in theaters, is that I was a fan and it served me some awesome scenes for a fan. So one was the duel between Jango Fett and Obi-Wan. This is because we never got a duel between like Boba Fett and a Jedi, other than Dark Forces. So if you played the original Dark Forces, you get to fight Boba Fett, but you're not a Jedi in the original Dark Forces. So this bounty hunter versus Jedi fight was actually pretty cool. You have Yoda finally doing something, which is this revelation of power. In Empire Strikes Back, the revelation of power is Yoda's able to like lift the ship and do some incredible things with the Force. In Attack of the Clones, you see Yoda cast his cane aside and like unleash the Force power and jump all over the place, lightsaber battling Dooku, and they're both CG'd basically when you're watching it. It's kind of interesting, but you get to finally see Yoda do this because it's been hinted at. If you just kept to your studies, you'd be as a swordsman, you'd rival Master Yoda as a swordsman. Then you finally get to see Yoda be a master swordsman at the end, and it's awesome. It's actually was a really cool moment in the theaters. I don't know if it holds up, but I certainly have a lot of nostalgia for it because I really wanted to see Yoda like be a badass, I guess, back in the day. So that's a big piece of fan service that I guess I have a little bit of affection for. The neurotic droids are back. I didn't like them that much the second time around. And then, of course, the big hordes of fighting Jedi, which I mentioned. There's a lot of time spent in the movie creating continuity between it and the original trilogy, between Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith, which would come after it. And this, for a lot of people, could be seen as a weakness. Because you're spending time with characters just talking about lore, it can feel like a little slow, and there's a little bit of a lull in the first act as a result. So you have Yoda and Mace Windu talk about how they can't see what's happening in the Force. They're feeling like their connection with the Force is weakened, and that they need to tell the Senate that they're unable to commune properly with the Force, which is a big setup for how episode 3 ended up panning out. Is that people are like, how did these Jedis not see this massive plot coming? It's like they couldn't see the massive plot coming way back in episode 1. They were having trouble communicating with the Force, and it was because it was being clouded by the dark side. The dark side was rising, and that's kind of a subtle thing, but is really important for setting up the movies that come afterwards. You finally get to see Uncle Owen. You get to see Anakin's mother die. You get to set up how Darth Vader, at the beginning of his fall, has to do with his passion and his love for those that are around him. You have Death Star plans at the end of the movie, which is interesting. So the Geonosians and Count Dooku had the Death Star plans at the end of this particular movie, and then you have this revolution of Count Dooku wanting Obi-Wan to be his apprentice and overthrow Darth Sidious. So overall, the story score ends up getting a 6.5 out of 10. That's it's passable. It's not quite an average, and that has to do with the weakness, primarily the weakness of the characters, which kind of affect the execution of how everything turns out. That being said, I still find it pretty interesting. Now, this one moment, I keep talking about this one moment of Christopher Lee. Here it is that he chops off Anakin's arm, and you can see him be incredibly sad about that and having this expression of dark worry when he does it. And this should reveal to you that he knows that Darth Sidious wants Anakin to be his apprentice, and he has harmed Anakin, and it's a worry. He's worried about the fact that Darth Sidious will be angry with him for doing this. At the same time, you notice that Dooku has not seriously harmed Obi-Wan, and that's because he wants Obi-Wan to join him so that he can overthrow Darth Sidious. This is actually a subtle thing that's executed in the movie, and it's one of those things that when people are like, oh, there's no subtlety in the prequels, it's like, that's not really true. Let's talk a little bit about this ring cycle stuff that I talked about in the previous one, and people have been talking about on the channel, I guess, for years now. So there's a relationship with this movie to Empire Strikes Back, besides the fact that they're both middle movies. There's a bunch of themes that are constant. So there's a Sith Lord trying to turn a younger Jedi for the purposes of overthrowing Darth Sidious. That's Dooku and Obi-Wan in this one. And there is a scene where he says, "You should join me. There's a Sith Lord that has control of the Senate. Join me, and we will overthrow the Sith." And he's appealing to, what's he appealing to? He's appealing to something that matters to Obi-Wan, and through our desire, that's how we're corrupted to the dark side. You have hands getting chopped off. That should be an obvious one. Anakin gets his hand chopped off. Luke gets his hand chopped off. At the end of Return of the Jedi, Luke chops off Vader's hand, realizes it's a robotic hand, and looks at his own and realizes that him and his father have essentially taken the same journey to the same point, but he's gonna do it differently this time. And so understanding the relationship between those movies, I think, makes that hand being chopped off it's a big symbolic thing at the end of Return of the Jedi. You have visions that tempt the hero into action. So in Empire Strikes Back, Luke is worried about Han and Leia. He's sensing that they're in trouble. And this one, you have Anakin sensing that his mother's in trouble, and that prompts him to go into action when he probably shouldn't. You have the temptation of the dark side in general, in the sense that you have the desire for power, the power to do good, but power nonetheless, and power corrupts. You also have tensions between master and the trainee, between apprentice and master. And this is between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is trying to get Anakin to do the right thing and not be so brash, not be so arrogant, not trust his power so much. And you have Yoda trying to convince Luke to take the slow, steady, and correct path, to be patient and not to be rash and follow his passions, because that's going to lead to suffering, which is going to lead to the dark side. And in both movies, you have that. You have the suffering that's going to lead to hatred, which is going to lead to the dark side. And the hatred of Vader gets turned on its head when Vader reveals that he's his father, in a sense. So you also have this love story with an initially resistant woman or hesitant woman. At the beginning of Empire Strikes Back, Leia is not particularly interested in Han, calls him a scruffy-headed nerf herder, I think. And then she gets tempted by the bad boy. In this case, the love story doesn't work as well, because Anakin's not really a bad boy. If Anakin had been like a brash, arrogant, real bad boy rather than being played off as angsty, I think it would have had a much more solid love affair. But at the beginning, you do have Padme who's like, "Don't look at me like that. Why? It makes me uncomfortable." It's like, dude, you're creepy. And maybe that was intentional, but Hayden Christensen does come off as a little creepy. You have Fett runs from the heroes in this one. So Obi-Wan is chasing Jango Fett. In the Empire Strikes Back, Boba Fett is chasing Han. It's kind of an interesting matchup there. And then you do have this fight between the Dark Master, the Dark Lord, and an unprepared, overconfident novice in the case of Anakin in Attack of the Clones and Luke in Empire Strikes Back. In fact, the final lightsaber battle is almost set up to visually evoke the Empire Strikes Back. Anakin cuts the wires and the room gets dark, and you see the lightsabers flashing in front of their faces, and you get this strong kind of feeling that you've seen this before in Empire Strikes Back with the darkened Cloud City, and just how scary and how strong of an emotional scene that was with that lightsaber battle of Luke and Darth Vader. So you have Anakin essentially ignore Obi-Wan's advice, just as Luke ignored Yoda's advice, charge into battle and get force lightninged over onto the ground by Count Dooku, who's like, "Lol, you're unprepared. You are not prepared." And then of course that throws the whole thing out of whack, and Yoda has to come in and save them. And in Empire Strikes Back, no one really comes in to save Luke. He's on his own because he is his master's too far away. So it ends a little bit differently, but you do have the hero getting the hand chopped off at the end for both. Last thing, let's talk about general effect. This is how I generally felt about the movie. So generally, I found this story pretty compelling. There's a little bit of a lull in the first act where they do some of that lore exposition, but for me it works because I'm a lore fan and I'm a fan of Star Wars. Other people, it may be too much. I don't know. And there's flaws in execution of certain subplots, particularly the romance. The grand villain isn't there. So in Empire Strikes Back, in all the original trilogy ones, you have Vader as this grand overarching villain, the villain that is so dangerous and is in pursuit of the heroes. In this one, it's not. Instead, you have a mystery story. and you're not really sure who you know that Dooku's kind of the villain, but he's not really revealed as to be as bad a villain as he is until towards the end of the movie. And I don't think the movie really suffers that bad for it, because the clone plotline, the plotline of what are the clones, that's primarily a mystery plotline. So you don't need a big bad guy waiting at the end, pursuing the heroes and making their trek extremely dangerous if you have a mystery that the hero is trying to figure out. And the hero in this case is Obi-Wan. The modern equipment improves the visual presentation. Watching a digital shot movie, all digital path, right? It's kind of like music. You know, something that's recorded digitally, listened to digitally, sounds pretty good. Something that's recorded on analog, listened to digitally, you can see the limitations, you can hear the limitations of the source material. And having watched the original trilogy on Blu-ray pretty recently, there's a lot more seams than I think people realize are there. Yeah, I think you're being a little nostalgic about the VHS, but the modern equipment for the Blu-ray with this nice sharp digital style really improved the visual presentation, I think, and I think it looks pretty good. I think the characters are the biggest flaw, and you know why now. The saber battles, I think, are actually pretty awesome in this one. Revenge of the Sith has, you know, again, takes them to another level. These are more conservative than that lightsaber battle at the end of episode 1, which is probably one of the best, but it's really hard to go to an even higher note when you have a great high note like the end of episode 1. But I still found them really compelling, and I found them much more emotional in a sense, and kind of a little bit deeper in the meaning behind them. You have essentially Obi-Wan fighting the master of his master, and you have Master and Padawan fighting each other. Yoda had taught Dooku, and they kind of reveal that. And so the emotional impact that it has on Yoda becomes apparent when when Dooku decides he's going to throw down this big piece of equipment and force Yoda to catch it to save Obi-Wan and Anakin. And Yoda becomes this old man again and picks up his cane and kind of crumples over, kind of in defeat. And the defeat was not that he had to destroy his Padawan, it's that he couldn't, right? Like he didn't have that choice offered to him. The final battle with all the droids, so much new stuff to see, so many cool new aesthetics to be brought in that contain threads to the original trilogy. That was a big piece of fan service that appealed a lot to me, I felt like. And to me, it felt more like Star Wars than either episode 1 or episode 3, actually. It felt very Star Wars to me, and it's hard for me to articulate every reason why, but it's that connection of the old and the new that's happening constantly. It's the exposition of the lore, which most people are probably not going to like, but which I thought was important and interesting and meaningful to me. It's the environments that they run through. It's the way they run through them. It's the presentation of the Jedi. It's all these little things that make it feel like Star Wars to me. And I just don't have that feeling with the Disney movies, you know? And those fan expectations for me were definitely delivered on. So overall, I'd probably say my general effect is an 8 out of 10. I felt like it was a good movie. It's a good movie for me. I actually really enjoyed watching it again, even though it had very significant flaws that I'm keenly aware of. To me, the general effect is still going to be an 8 out of 10. So that gives an overall score of 8 out of 10. That's a B. And that's all I really have to say about it. If you think that this is too high, go back and look at it the way I looked at it. And I think you might see that there's actually a lot to Attack of the Clones. I think it's probably the most underrated Star Wars movie. I think episode 1, it's probably slightly underrated, but there's a lot of problems in episode 1. This one, the problems are there, but there's also like a lot going on in the movie that's very interesting for fans of the lore, and is just good. It's really well done. So I think it's probably the most underrated Star Wars movie. And so final score, 8 out of 10. Really strong aesthetics and visual presentation. Weak characters once again, but a strong enough general effect and a strong enough, an interesting enough plot to make it get to an 8 out of 10. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you will leave me your thoughts down below and what you thought maybe about these particular elements, and whether it delivered on your expectations the way that you wanted it to or not. And let me know what you want to see and what you want to hear in the future. You can find me at dbspress.com, davidvstewart.com. You can find me at facebook.com/davidvandyke-stewart, twitter.com/davidvstewart, gab.ai/davidvstewart. I'm on Minds as well as DBS Press, so you can find me in all those different places. Minds, I probably don't interact with quite as much as other people, but I'm on all the other ones pretty consistently. Or email me, stu@davidvstewart.com. You can hop on my mailing list, dvspress.com/list, and I'll give you a free book for heading over onto that email list and joining my email list and being ready for the next books that are going to come out this year. So I'll see you guys next time, and have a great day.